Welcome to the Outside Insights podcast. Our goal is to provide content and ideas that help you close your personal and professional gaps, frankly, by hearing how others have done it. I'm your host, Chris Burkhardt, and today I am thrilled beyond words to have Ari Weinzweig on the show today. Welcome to the show, Ari.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm honored.
Thanks for being on Outside Insights. So I know it's a place a lot of people start with you, but it is the beginning. It's been a minute, but how does a kid from suburban Chicago who ate fish sticks and mac and cheese and every other big branded food industrial product end up a restaurateur with artisan food?
Yeah. Well, one day I woke up and I was in the food. No,
Yeah.
I came to Ann Arbor from Chicago, where I grew up, as you said, to go to school at University of Michigan, which I did. I studied Russian history, which I think we'll come back to later
We will.
in a very unpleasantly painful way. After graduating with my history degree, there isn't anything you can really do with a history degree except go get more degrees, which there's nothing wrong with. That's what I was supposed to do, but I didn't really know what kind
I
of
guess you can
degrees.
study more and more, right?
Well, you can always study more, but it's meant more as an entree into a second degree, not as an end in and of itself. And that was fine. I mean, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do next. And we may or may not talk about our visioning process, but it's a huge piece of what we do. But when I graduated, I had no vision at all, only what David White, Whyte, whose work you may already know. And I would highly recommend anybody who's out there looking for good books to read.
Ari, is he the one that talks about it's better to know what you don't like?
Well, this is called, he calls it the via negativa. And I don't think he says it's better, but he says it's better than nothing.
Oh, better than okay.
And that's what it was for me. So I knew I didn't want to move home. That was basically my negative vision. And then in order to make that viable, obviously I needed a job, and I had driven a taxi part-time while I was in school, which was fine, but not all that interesting. And one of my college roommates was waiting tables at a restaurant here in Ann Arbor. And I don't know, I thought, all right, well, he likes his job. I'll go try that. And as you alluded, I had zero culinary background, and I really had no business background. Nobody in my family was in business. They were all teachers, doctors, dentists, lawyers, psychologists. So I was kind of the failure of the family for never going to get an advanced degree. And, I just thought, all right, I don't know, I got to do something for a while I figure out my life. And so I went in and I applied for a job as a server like he had, my roommate had, and they we had a nice interview. They said they'd call if something opened, but they didn't call. So after a couple of weeks, I started to have higher anxiety. So I went back and thought, all right, I'll reapply as a busboy. And then if I do good work, they could promote me later. And once again, nice conversation. Once again, no call. And so by a month had gone by. The month had gone by, rent was starting to come due or getting close. And I thought, all right, I got to do something. So I went back a third time, which we now know is called emotional resilience, and offered to do anything. I really didn't have a clue what that would mean, but they said, okay, great. Well, we do have a dishwashing job. Do you want that? And I said, sure. And they said, could you start tomorrow? And that's how I started. So I really just lucked out. I had zero aspiration to work with food, zero aspiration to be in business. I don't think either of them were even on the mental menu that I would have had in my head of what career paths would look like. But I really just lucked out. I love the food. I'm still very motivated by studying the food, making our food better every day. I cook in some version every night at home late when I get back from the roadhouse. And then I also stumbled into great people. So my business partner of now 43 years, Paul Saginaw, his first day as general manager at that same restaurant was my first day as a dishwasher. And that's how we met. And then you have the little chapbook I did on life lessons from being a line cook, and Frank
We'll make
Carollo.
sure it gets all your books will get in liner notes, of course, Ari,
okay,
but
awesome.
I know this is one of your newest ones.
Frank Carollo was the line cook, and he started teaching me how to line cook. So I moved up from dishwasher, and I just got lucky because he was there. And later he became the managing partner at our bakery, which is terrific. And then the following year, Maggie Bayless started as a cocktail waitress. And all these years later, she became in 1994 the managing partner at Zing Train, our training business. So really, I just lucked out in that I found work I love. There's a quote in Managing Ourselves book, the green one, from Paul Goodman.
Behind me,
who did get some advanced degrees, another nice Jewish boy. He didn't know what he wanted to do. But anyway, he said, having a vocation is like falling in love, and it works out. Right. And so
Amen.
we've all, in a good way, everybody who's listening to this has fallen in love with ideas, or it doesn't have to be your significant other. It could be an idea, a project, a concept, a philosophy, or whatever, and it didn't work out. And that's the norm, and I just really feel fortunate that I really found this work. And then Paul, Frank, and Maggie have contributed enormously to my life, and so have many other people over the years. But just the fact that they happen to be there,
Yeah.
just luck,
So I was first exposed to the Zingerman community of businesses, which I'm sure we'll talk about,
Yeah.
through a book, The Small Giants. I have no
Yep.
idea what year that was. I'm going to 08, 09. Maybe I'm in that, just dating us both, frankly. But
Something like that.
I found it really highlighted a lot of the principles by which you live and run the business.
Mm-hmm.
And, you'd think it would be more normalized today, the approach to business, but just love to have you talk a bit about the principles and philosophies of the Zingerman companies.
Yeah. So let me, what I'll do is finish our origin story and then use that to segue directly into your question. So I stayed and worked for that restaurant group for about 4 years. The last couple of years were managing kitchens. So my background, for food people listening, is all back of the house originally, just to show you that introverted line cooks can learn to speak in public. And Paul left about
always
half.
the server, by the way, Ari. They always gave me the biggest table. I always had to wait on the mayor. I don't know why.
It's because you're good at talking, and now here you are.
Yeah,
Not in a
maybe.
bad way.
Well, I
You
did
can
still
carry on
wine
a
on it.
conversation, which is what a lot of what serving is.
You're right.
So Paul left about halfway through my 4 years there, and he opened a little fish market here in town that's called Monahan's, which is still one of the best in the country. He and I stayed friends. We would talk here and there about doing our own place, which is a very common. Like, I don't know if in banking people talk about opening their own bank one day, but in the food business, almost everybody at some point thinks they're going to do their own. Most
You're right.
don't.
Me and my friend Pat were going to open a breakfast place. So
Well,
you
there's
were
still
right
time,
on.
dude. There's still time. Unlike brain surgery, you can go into food later in life. But anyway, I reached a point in the fall of 1981, which is now, I realize, closer to World War II than it is to today. But I reached a point where it's not like I hated going to work, but it was just less and less, and inspiring. And they didn't write a vision the way we do, but I could sense where they were headed strategically was not really what I wanted to do. And so I just was like, time to do something else. So I gave 2 months notice. I didn't really know what I was going to do next. That was November 181. In one of those other life stories that really worked out beautifully, Paul called me like 2 days later, and he's like, hey, there's this little building coming open near the fish market. Let's go check it out. Maybe you should leave your other job and we could open that deli. He had grown up in Detroit, where you could get good deli food. In Chicago, you could get it, but not here. And of course, I had already given notice, so I was only 60 days away from being unemployed anyway. And we went and looked, and I really don't know how we went this quick, but within like a week, we decided we would open. And 4.5 months later, we had renovated the whole space, which at the time the building was celebrating its 80th anniversary. It was built in 1902.
So were you renovated before you had a name, or was it just kind of running parallel?
We just started renovating. I mean, we needed to do the floors and the walls and all that. And 4.5 months later, we were open. So March 15th, 1982 is our formal opening date. It was a Monday, and it was just me and Paul, 2 employees. 25 sandwiches on the menu, 29 seats, all the old Jewish stuff he and I had both grown up with in our respective families, but then also a little bit of what's now well known as specialty food, but in 1982 was not known at all, and mostly was considered just to be strange and weird, like extra virgin olive oil. So that's how we got open. The philosophy. So I would never have used the word philosophy in 1982, but that's in hindsight what we have. I wrote a pamphlet on food and philosophy, which really could be applied to any line of work or life.
Yeah.
And it's sort of my belated glimpse of the obvious that it's all philosophy, even though my negative beliefs about philosophy early in my life were sort of this, to be or not to be, and go nowhere with it. It's actually, as Peter Block, who I just talked to the other day, whose books have been a huge influence, and I there's a story in the food philosophy pamphlet that I started to go like, well, but like, what if people don't have a philosophy? So I called Peter, and he goes, they all have a philosophy. You can't make a decision without a philosophy. They may not know it's a philosophy. They may not call it a philosophy, but the philosophy is just what you use to make decisions. And I was like, okay, well, we had one in 1982, even though we didn't call it that. And I would say where we are 43 years later is, if I don't know, if you just imagine sort of I'm not a musician, but like a song that somebody started in their bedroom on a acoustic guitar when they
Yeah.
were 16, and 10 years later it actually came out in a well-produced album. It's sort of that thing, like the core of the song, the spirit of it is still there, but they've now learned to play a lot more instruments, and the engineering work and the production work are good and don't destroy the essence of the music. They bring it out. So that's kind of what I would say.
So Ari, I am in the staffing business. I've been in my family's been in it for almost 50 years, and people come and think $1 an hour is going to make them happy,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And what I find is a question for you is that a lot of folks don't know themselves.
Yeah.
And I think you alluded to it in what you just said. How, as a young person, did you figure out your own culture and values while establishing it within the business? It sounds like it was almost simultaneous.
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who's done anything for this long at a high level has learned a lot about themselves in the process. And it's so a couple things I'll say. One is the Managing Ourselves book, which I'm sure you have. I wrote quite a bit, and also in the Beliefs book, which is the blue one, about my strong belief that it's all one life. So there's a very sort of industrial mindset that teaches people to separate their work life from their personal life, and like it's
Yeah.
two different things. And I find that very unhelpful and unproductive, because you're the same person in both. And I'm not saying don't have boundaries. I'm not saying don't take time off. I'm just saying, like, the idea that you wouldn't think of work when you're at home, or that you wouldn't think about your significant other or your kid while you're in a meeting, is ridiculous.
I find, don't want to interrupt your
You
flow at
go
all,
right
but
ahead.
I find in so many ways it's that people are sort of method acting at work and they're not able to be themselves. And my sense is, where we share a common ground, is people should be able to express themselves in a way that's genuine, that's them. Certainly we have a culture and we have a way,
Yeah.
but I don't think they feel like they have to method act. And that's maybe why they can be the same.
Yeah, and that's a big piece of it, and we'll get into dignity later in the conversation, I think. But one of the 6 elements is about authenticity, and that's really what you're talking about. And and I don't know. I mean, it's not like I didn't know myself at all when we opened in
Yeah.
1982, but there's a lot of work that I'm still doing, because I'll be doing it for the rest of my life. But that, commenced in a more formal way, I don't know, 5, 6 years after we opened, 7 years after we opened, as I started to, screw up parts of my life unwittingly and unintentionally, but essentially through the lack of self-awareness. And that's a lot of what the book Managing Ourselves is just the things I learned from it and sharing my own experiences. And I really agree with you. And I believe, I mean, if we don't know ourselves well, it's hard to do great work.
Yes.
Number one. Number two, the sad reality is that most organizations, because church groups, soccer teams, and jazz bands are also organizations, and countries are organizations, whether we think of them that way or not. And so a lot of people are caught up in organizational ecosystems that don't want them to be who they are. There's definitely frames around what's possible here, like our values
Yes.
in our vision, but we don't need to treat anybody with indignity. Even if they don't fit that frame, we can treat them with dignity while helping them go to an organizational ecosystem that's better suited to them. So anyway, one of my big learnings, in the work that manifested in Managing Ourselves, was just the sort of belated glimpse of the obvious, that, like, at work, I had always gone into it with this belief that, of course, dude, we got to study, we got to learn more, we got to keep working on things every day. It's challenging, but we're going to make the food better. We're going to figure out this service stuff, and that's how we always went into it. But then I realized in my personal life, I had somehow gotten this belief that, like, if things were good, it would just be working out. And,
Yeah.
if you had to work at it, that it was really wrong and it wasn't naturally aligned. And then it was like, man, if I had done this at work, we would have been out of business in a year. It's
Yeah.
only because we were, not just me, but we were working at it so hard that we were able to survive and, do what we did. And I'm like, so how come at work I got this thing where I'm busting my ass, and out of work, I'm like, well, if it doesn't work out, it must be the wrong relationship or the wrong whatever. So that's when I really started to take the same approach to me as I did to work, which is read books, go to therapy, study myself, pay more attention, try to figure out how to get better, honor where I screwed up, learn from it, etc.
Ari, I'm so glad you shared that, because I have a string of entrepreneurs on the show, and that vulnerability, I mean, for me, it's 26 years, but I'm an overnight success in 26 years, and
Yeah.
you're an overnight success in 44 years, right? Or whatever
Yep.
the number is. It's like, it just doesn't happen that way. We've got bad days too,
Everybody
and
has bad days, and there's no good days or bad days, because even the good days are filled with unpleasant things. You just blacked them out. And even the bad days had good things. We just forgot about them. So,
well said. So I keep moving you a bit, but you know where to go with the core of your ideas whenever you'd like.
yeah. No, I mean, that's, so the managing ourselves is part 3 in the leadership book series. I tried to write them all so you could start wherever you want. After it came out, it was not an uncommon comment, in a nice way, people who had read part 1 and 2, and they're like, well, shouldn't you have written this one first? Like, don't people need to know this before they open their business? And I'm like, well, A, I didn't write it first, so it's moot. And B, yeah, they should know it before they open their business. But the reality is, very few people are willing to invest the time and energy into self-awareness until they mess up enough stuff that the pain requires you to do something.
So I'm curious then, Zing Train and your writing, kind of
Mm-hmm.
lumping them together, were they a means to learn and make people better? Was that the original inspiration? Was that the
Well,
culture of learning?
so you want writing first or Zing Train first?
You're in charge, brother, whatever way you want to take it.
Okay, so Zing Train, so in 1993, so 11 years in business, we've been, in quotes, we were a success by the world standards, and we had grown to, I don't know, 120 employees from 2, and we'd been written up in the New York Times and Gourmet and Bon Appetit and Food and Wine and all those things. But anyway, when we had opened the deli, we didn't write a vision the way that we now do, but it's a natural law of business and life that anyone who's getting to greatness, whether that's in parenting or in professional basketball or in the staffing business or whatever, they all have a vision of where they're going. And most of them don't write it down, which isn't inherently bad. I mean, we didn't write ours down.
Ari, is that a BHAG when you say vision?
It's more than that. I'll tell you. So the vision, as we do it, and I'm not here to argue with others, but our definition would include the BHAG, but there's a lot more to it than that. So for us, like a big goal could say, whatever, we're going to grow to $100 million in sales, or we're going to be number 1 in blah, blah, blah. But this is a story. So it's not just one line. That line might well be included, but it's a story of what success will look like, feel like, in our case, taste like, when we get to that success at a particular point in time. So our vision for 2032, which we wrote during 2018, 2019, and rolled out. Well, we were supposed to roll it out in March of 2020, but that didn't happen.
Can't imagine why.
But we did roll it out in January of 2021, unchanged, because the vision is the story of what you want to create, and it's done from the heart, not from a strategic analysis of momentary issues. So the vision as we do it would include those big goals, but it would also talk about how the people who work there feel. How do you feel if it's your personal vision? It's whatever matters. So it's the story of your life.
It's not a 15-year plan of numbers and operational disciplines.
It's not.
And
It can
milestones.
include the key ones. I studied Russian history, so I am familiar with the Soviet 5-year plan, which would tell you 4 years from now in February on the 23rd of that month how many potatoes you're going to buy. But that's not this. This describes the cathedral that we're working to construct together. It doesn't tell you which.
By the way, It's a lot easier to remember a narrative than it is how many potatoes you're going to buy 4 years
Absolutely.
from now.
Absolutely. And it connects with people emotionally too. So, coming back to vision. So, when we opened the deli, we did not know you could write a vision. It's not like we were opposed. We just never heard of it. And so we did what everybody else did. We tried to take what was in our heads and translate it. In the story of visioning at Zingerman's pamphlet, I sort of get into the details of this, but in hindsight, what I would say the highlights of our vision, and like I said, now it would be a much more detailed story, but the headlines of the various sections would have been something like, we knew from the beginning we wanted it someplace unique and special. We were very intent on not creating just a copy of somebody else's business, but in Ann
Right.
Arbor. We knew we wanted really amazing food. We knew we wanted great service. We've always worked with the belief that it's our job to give the customer as many reasons as possible to want to come and visit us and spend time and money with us. We knew we wanted a great place for people to work. We knew that we wanted to do it in a very down-to-earth setting, which in 2025 doesn't sound that radical, but in 1982, to get world-class food, you mostly had to get kind of dressed up and go into a fancy restaurant. And we wanted it to just be like you and me right now, just go, yeah, let's go over there and, eat some amazing cheese that nobody else in town's ever tasted. And we knew from the beginning we only wanted one. So no disrespect to those who open multiple units, but it's never been my thing. The general wisdom when we opened is we were doomed to fail. Ann Arbor had whatever, a dozen delis close in the previous decade. People told us we were stupid for opening in the location that we did because it's about 6 blocks from downtown Ann Arbor. So we were off the beaten track. There's still no parking to this day. And a few people listening can remember when there were still no cell phones, so people didn't have a map in their pocket, and there's a plethora of weird one-way streets, and people would get completely confused trying to find us. Anyway, 6-7 years later, we were geniuses, and now by then everybody knew we were going to be successful from the day we opened, and it was a great location. And
But everybody was on the same page there.
Yeah, totally. They were all there on the first date. Fast forwarding to 1986, we added on a little bit to the deli. 91, we renovated the house next door. So we're in a historic district. We were pretty sure we had, pushed our envelope to whatever they would let us do by doing these 2 additions or renovations. And in 1993, about 10 in the morning on a nice summer day. I don't know what day it was when I should have been inside getting the sandwich line ready for the lunch rush. And Paul grabbed me and he sat me down on a little bench out front of the deli. And he kind of looks at me and he's like, okay, in 10 years, what are we doing? And I was like, what? It's like,
I
in
got to
10
go in
years, what
there
are we
and get
doing?
stuff done.
I'm like, Paul, I don't know what we're doing in 10 years. Like, why are you even asking me this? He goes, well, I mean, we said we only want to open one place. So we've already turned down offers to open in Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland. We won't open on campus, even though people keep offering us the chance to do it because we only want one. But other people are now opening because they're copying us, and it's not as good, but it's more convenient. Like, what are we doing in 10 years? I'm like, dude, I got work to do. And he's like, no, this is our work. So in hindsight, with our current language, which we didn't yet have, he was asking me, what's your vision? In hindsight, I would say he had a very good intuitive sense that we had fulfilled the original unwritten vision. In hindsight, I would say it's a little like organizational midlife. Any organization that survives its opening gets to that point. And it's also what John O'Donohue, the Irish philosopher whose work and writer I love, calls a threshold. So it's sort of where you, like anybody listening to this will have been through any number of them. Like you bust your butt to get somewhere that you kind of know you could get there. You doubt yourself, but you keep going, you get there, and then you realize, oh, it's only the beginning. I'm not really
I always
done.
called that put the stake in the ground, and then you realize you're there, and it's almost worse to get to it.
Yeah. Well, it just opens new doors. So Paul's question helped us to deal with it in a way that I wasn't ready for at the time. It's not like we were satisfied, because from day one, we've always believed you got to improve all the time. I mean, long before there was a Toyota Way. But now I would say there's an enormous difference between improving what you have and creating a long-term inspirational vision that you drafted. So anyway, a long story short, that question started a year of long walks, arguments, eye rolls, lots of swear words, etc., trying to figure out what to do, continually coming back to the table till we could figure it out, which we always did just instinctively, informally, which is, I know, not the norm, but it's just what we both did. And now it's systematized into the way that we operate at the partner level by consensus. During that year, we got to know a guy named Stash Kazmierski, who just happened to be a consultant at a company called Dana Miller Tyson.
Okay.
They were just up the block. Kathy Dana Miller was nationally known. This is the early 90s. She was nationally known for her progressive organizational change work, and Stash joined their firm. So I don't have an office, but everybody who does aspires mostly to get out of the office. And because the deli was a block away, it was a wonderful escape for them where they could still have meetings in a less formal setting. So they would all come down there. And I don't know whether Paul started talking to Stash or I did. Neither of us can remember. But one of us was like, yeah, man, we're trying to figure this out. And so he had learned this visioning process from a guy named Ron Lippitt, who was at the University of Michigan Institute of Social Research in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And Ron had taught it to many people, what he called preferred futuring. It was getting clear on the future you want. So anyway, long story short, Stash taught it to us. Long story short, we changed the name of it to Visioning, and it was originally done around community development, but we made it more into what we do. And to your earlier question, part of what Stash later told me that we did, but nobody else had done, was to weave in the big goals into the story. And so that's part of what we do, is that we combine strategic aspirations with emotionally meaningful background stuff.
In some way, if you have a great organization or an average one, people are going to say, hey, boss, where are we going?
Absolutely. And usually the answer is like, well, I think this and that. And, I'm not saying you're going to do this, but it's a very regular interview question. Just happened to me yesterday on somebody called to do prep for another thing I'm doing. And she's like, so one of our questions, where do you imagine, do you have a sense of where you're going to be in the future? And I'm like, yeah, I know exactly where we're going to be. I'll send it to you. It's our 2032 vision, so.
I would have known that because I knew you had one. So
yes, that's why I'm not cutting on you. I'm just laughing that mostly when they ask, it's a good question, which provokes a very open-ended hemming and hawing answer. But in our case, it's like, yeah, here, I'll give it to you. But anyway, so out of that conversation with Stash's guidance on the process, not on the content that came from us, we wrote our first vision. It was called Zingerman's 2009, and it's 6 pages long. It's in the back of that Story of Visioning pamphlet, and it described that we would grow, and you could tell we went 15 years in the future, not 10, by the way, but that we would create a community of businesses, that each business in that community would be a Zingerman's business, but each would have its own unique specialty so that we could keep the deli unique but still grow, that each business would have a partner or managing partners in it because we liked being partners. And it just seemed like, at least in the food world, the further you get from the owner's innate passion, the less energy there would be in the restaurant. Like, it's just, the odds of the 8th one, or the one in Las Vegas that the chef was only there for 2 weeks in the opening and comes back once a year, it's not the same as going to the original one. So we thought, by having a managing partner in there, it means somebody's really deeply committed to that product area, and then that we would operate as one organization with these semi-autonomous pieces within it. Anyway, so the business school story about ZingTrain is that Paul and I were brilliant strategists, and we realized that people would want to know how we were working, and so we started ZingTrain. But the true story is not that at all. It's that Maggie Bayless, who had worked with us when she was a cocktail waitress, she was a German lit major from Oberlin, halfway between where you are and where I am in Ohio. And she had also tried to figure out her life, worked in restaurants where we met. And then she went back to Michigan and got her MBA at U of M and fell in love with training work. And she, while loving training, was perpetually dissatisfied or frustrated with the organization she was trying to work in. So first she went to General Motors, which is what Michigan MBAs did back in that day. And that was obviously not very rewarding for her. And then she switched and went to a small consulting firm in town that specialized in training systems, which was great content-wise. But as she says, she learned that dysfunction in an organization wasn't really that tied to size. So you could
Yeah.
be small and dysfunctional or large. Anyway, when we shared our 2009 vision, as I remember the story, she was always lamenting that she couldn't find a place to do the work and training she wanted. And her husband said, well, why don't they wrote this vision about having partners in other Zingerman's businesses. Why don't you go talk to Paul and Ari? And she did. And so that's where it came from. So it wasn't me and Paul. It was Maggie's vision of what we could do.
But it came from the vision, and then it kind of happened.
So one of the many, many, many benefits of visioning is that when you share a vision of the future, and people can help you. So mostly people want to help you, but they don't know where you're going. So your parents have a vision for you. And if you don't have your own, they fill the void by giving you advice on how to go to the vision they held for you.
Seems like this interests me. I hope it interests you.
Yeah.
Your ability to create effective systems seems as important as having the managing partner.
Yes, correct. And the bigger the business gets, the more the systems become implicitly important.
So did you just, one of the partners of one of the business have this skill, or did it come from visioning, or were you or Paul gifted?
From all of us. When we were small, it wasn't really a big issue in my mind. In fact, I was happy to be freed from the corporate restaurant world.
Yeah. Yes.
And that was really wrong on my part. But as you know, when you only have 2 employees, you don't need a lot of systems because it doesn't mean they're bad, but it's easier to get away without them because you're there all the time. Like there was less of an issue. But part of what Maggie helped us to do by creating Zinc Train was to take our already existing desire to organize things better and bring her training systems design work into play. And that's just, now it's pretty well ensconced in the organization. And then over the last 20 years too, on top of that, Tom Root, who's one of the partners at Mail Order, became deeply impassioned around lean and the work that could come from that. And so he's, made that in many ways, this is my words, not his, but his vocation. And so, his passion for that and study of that and has impacted the organization too. So there's a lot of work around that. And part of my big belated glimpse of the obvious, which is a different BGO, not a BHAG, was the realization that good systems design is as much a creative act as cooking. So anyway, Zinc Train started from that, and then it grew to teach people our approaches, and that's really what we do. We don't really do consulting. It's really just training on our approaches with the belief that they're best used when people adapt them, not just wholesale paste them on, but adapt them to their own setting.
Not like you need the commercial, but my favorite is your bottom line change pamphlet, quite frankly.
Yeah. You and Vern Harnish, he loves that one.
Well, and I'm a scaling up coach, so that makes a lot of sense. Well, it's because we get it wrong. Like you say, no matter where you do the 4 steps, no matter where you start, right? So, might as well do it right.
Yep. So last thing on Zinc Train, I'll just say is you mentioned Small Giants earlier, which Bo Burlingham wrote. And in one of the many times he interviewed me, he said, the people in our organization, he said, very few of them will ever fully appreciate how much benefit the organization has gotten by Zinc Train's presence. So, by percentage of our total sales, it's a pretty small piece of the sales, but by percentage of the intellectual contribution to the organization, it's way bigger. And it manifests in ways that people don't even realize. But like anybody who's been here and is paying attention after 4 or 5 months could facilitate a meeting, right? And that's because we're used to having well-run meetings with agendas and stuff. And it's not only Zinc Train, but
you have fewer, weaker links.
Yeah. All these mindsets that, in the same way, if we talk about democracy, that the people in the US until recently have gotten used to being able to say whatever they want, whenever they want, even if it's complaining about whoever, they don't really worry about it. Like here, people have an amount of freedom and opportunity to contribute that is easy to forget that you have it. And that most
if you know what to expect, it's easier to be creative.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot. Yeah. And a lot of that came out of Zinc Train's work, and what we teach is very different than what most other places teach. And back to your earlier question about personal development, part of why I believe it's so powerful is that everything we teach is fully aligned with how you want to be as a human being. Whereas I would say most business training is at best neutral to that and often antithetically opposed to how you want to be. So you're taught to compete, dominate the market, cut off the supplier, squeeze the supplier, but then you're supposed to go home and be kind and generous, and it doesn't work.
And at best, it's technical.
Right.
At
And
best.
so this is really, when you learn visioning, then you can apply it in your personal life. When you learn the beliefs work, you apply it in your personal life. When you learn dignity, you do it with your kid. So it's really the same things. And I think that gives it a lot more power, and it just resonates with people in an interesting way. So one of the most common over the many years we've been doing this, when I teach, when we do the reflection at the end of what's like the most interesting thing people learn, it's a very common reflection is, I realized that I've been thinking a lot of this for years, but everybody else told me I was crazy. But now I realize I'm not.
You're in a place where it fits.
Because you're in an ecosystem where those natural behaviors are honored instead of being demeaned.
Ari, feel free to go where you want to go. I want to make sure you tell the stories.
You want to go to the writing. I'm going to follow your interviewer's
very good
lead. So the writing started. I don't think of myself as a writer, but Lord knows I write a lot. So
measuring it in inches.
Well, yes. That doesn't even count the e-news, which comes out every week. And
there you go.
A lot more on that. But so, I mean, I'm a history major, so it's not like I didn't know how to write a paper, but writing a history paper is not what I would say is writing, at least in the way I want to do it. No disrespect to history. I love history. But so when we started the deli in 82, we had a couple people writing, it was then all on paper newsletter, 1 page, 2 sides, whatever it was, 8.5 by 14, then different physical manifestations. Then we went to newsprint at some point because we could make a lot more copies for a lot less money, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, when the people who were doing the work on the newsletter would do it, it was good, but I never really loved it. And I was kind of low grade frustrated. And in hindsight, of course, I would say it was my fault, not theirs, because I wasn't clear on what I really wanted. And they were just doing the best they could from their perspective. But anyway, one of them moved out west to take a different job, another city, common move in the food world. And I was like, screw it. I'm just going to do this myself. And so I started writing, and then I really didn't know anything about writing. I've always read a lot, but that's not the same as, it's a good prerequisite, but it's not the skill itself. So I started writing, and at that point it was all by hand. And I would, be super perfectionist and freak myself out about this sentence wasn't right and like not being able to get it. And, it was really frustrating me, but I kept going. I guess that's more emotional resilience and putting it out. And then I started to get more and more nice compliments on the writing. And then people start saying what they say to everybody who writes anything, you really should do a book. And then they would go like, well, you already have the whole thing because you've written all these newsletters. And of course, that's totally wrong, but it's a nice, well-intended
sentiment.
comment. Yeah. And so at some point, I don't know, the mid 90s, I was like, you know what? I really should go learn about writing because I know nothing about it. So I started reading books about writing, and then somebody told me about a writing group. So I got in the writing group where I learned a ton, and I was in there for like 10 years. And then I read a lot of books on it, and I just kept working at it. And so first I really only wrote about food, but then like you alluded earlier, when we started Zinc Train, and then I was sort of running out of topics to write about food. And then I realized, well, I should be writing. I had a column for one of the trade magazines, and I started throwing in, I don't know, something on service, something on servant leadership. And that went really well. And eventually it turned into all those books that you have.
Yeah. So, and then would you say, are these popular books, they're in your lending library? Do you see them, people reading them on breaks, or is it more a part of onboarding, or,
It's all of the above. I'm a big reader, as you are, but most people aren't. Having nothing to do with social media, that's always been true. It's even worse now. But
probably why your chat books are so good.
offer a free copy to anybody who works here for the reading. if not all, I mean, most do not take me up on it, but I feel like offering is a nice thing. And then some do, and some it really makes a difference. And, so anyway, and then I guess implicit in your question before, yeah, I learned a ton from the writing. It forces me to get to what Maggie at Zing Train taught us to call the fourth level of learning, which is teaching. And my realization a few years ago that writing was just teaching on paper,
You're
and
right.
teaching is the highest level of learning because you can't do it well unless you get some level of clarity of what you're saying. Like anybody can talk endlessly and say nothing, but to be able to go on for half an hour or 20 minutes or 2 hours and say, like, here's the 3 steps to great service. This is why we do it. This is how we do it. Here's some of the things we screwed up is a big advantage.
People figure out pretty quickly if you use a few acronyms and buzzwords and that's all there is, you might not really know enough, right?
Yeah, and and then I've been doing this e-news weekly for the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, and you can put the link in the show notes. But
Yes.
when I mostly wrote about food again in the beginning, with occasional small bit on leadership, and then in the winter of 2020, when the pandemic came, and people had blocked it out to a great degree, but all of us, everybody I knew certainly was, I don't know. I mean, I felt like my business life was passing in front of my eyes, so it's not like it was ever easy, but all of a sudden it was really bad.
Seems like everything I learned up until that point was irrelevant.
Well, some things probably were not, like emotional
Yes.
resilience, but
Yes.
anyway, so I started to put the leadership piece up top in the e-news because and then I got a lot of response. Like, it was so hopeful to read that. It really helped. And then I got more. And then I was like, I wasn't trying to build hope, but I had written about hope. And then I went back and I'm like, oh yeah, this is what I'm doing, like unconsciously by sharing this context. So anyway, the leadership piece has stayed up top for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's always longer and more in depth. But my point in answering your question is just meet, in quotes, so many people that I wouldn't have known about if I wasn't doing that writing. And every week, like, I'm learning the history of these people that I just wouldn't have known. So like, what's today? Thursday. So yesterday's came out, and I wrote about the poet Charles Simic, who I wouldn't have known at all. And then I wrote about Walter Brueggemann, the theologian and philosopher who whose work I wouldn't have known either. From each one of those, I gather all this information that it's hugely helpful to me, and I'm hopefully creating frameworks that help. So yesterday I wrote about this idea of regenerative marketing as a resistance tool to the mainstream activity of the country. And I never really would have thought of it that way, but just more and more, like, combining the work of Walter Brueggemann and the poetry of Charles Simic with this woman, Carol Sanford, who passed away in December. It was like, yeah, you can actually, marketing doesn't have to be extractive and deceptive. It can be this uplifting thing that A, is true, not phony, and that speaks to truth, and B, that's helping people who take in the marketing, whether that's, in my case, writing or video or whatever, but to really think more and more in depth and to do self-reflection. So if the marketing's doing that, it changes the country.
Ari, it's not lost on me, for a guy who wanted to stay local to Ann Arbor, your writing has created a bit of a broader community. And what a nice thing that is.
Yeah. Yeah. My desire was never to not travel or to not impact. It's just the idea of doing business where you live. For me,
Yes.
It resonates a lot more than what feels a little colonial, which is starting to tell people in Vancouver what to do from southeastern Michigan, or somebody in London deciding the price of what a Zingerman's cappuccino should be. Doesn't really feel good to me. So,
Ari, these are weird times of uncertainty. Folks are struggling.
yeah.
I was touched by a few things, the element of art and appreciation and how they work for you and your community.
Yep.
Had a chance to listen to you speak about the elements of dignity.
Yeah.
And I want to keep us to, a comfortable time, but I feel like if we could focus on those things, I would really appreciate it. I think my audience would benefit.
Yeah, I'm honored to do it. You want art first or dignity first?
Let's go art first.
Okay. So there's a pamphlet which you have called The Art of Business, which essentially was an attempt to express my understanding and my belief that business and life are a lot more like art or music or poetry than most of us are trained to believe. And, we sort of have this, if you're not an artist, we have this image that, art's for the artists, you and I go to work. And what started to get me thinking was the self-fulfilling belief cycle that I wrote a lot about in the Giant Power of Beliefs book, and realizing that our beliefs alter what we see, they alter what we do. It's just the reality from hanging out with artists or musicians, like they just notice more, so like artists or like writers notice, the nuance of the room in a way that a consumer of the room who's not a bad person, they're just not paying attention at that level. And so I started to think like, well, if everybody went through their whole life like they were an artist, they would be like looking at all this nuance and paying attention to the details and trying to translate it into their own way to express it. And that like a lot of people are trained to go through life and just sort of get through and be happy because they had a good weekend, or they watched the, whatever Bears game on Sunday and the Bears won, or they went to their kid's graduation and it was really fulfilling. And those are all wonderful and awesome, but they're small bits. And I realized like the artist mindset is just like that every little thing you do is art. And that I just started to teach, and I wrote in there, I mean, it's like, well, if you think of your life like a painting that you're making, and in 100 years you'll be gone, but people are going to go to some museum and see that painting on the wall, then you realize like the way you treat the cashier at the drugstore, or the way you talk to your cousin's kid at
It is
Christmas,
such a
those are
different,
all changing your painting, and then you're like, damn, I would have done that brushstroke a lot different if I realized somebody was going to be looking at it in the Louvre in 2093, and so that's really what I started to look at.
such a more eloquent way to think about seizing the day, memento mori, from the art
Yeah.
perspective, that, and folks get a little numb.
Yeah.
That's really,
But
I
the artist mindset is that you're not numb, because there's something everywhere. And I wrote a piece in the e-news a few weeks ago. You can put the link in the show notes. That was around this artist, Lonnie Holly, who's 75, Alabama, lived an incredibly hard early life, was born in 1950. So still Jim Crow South, experienced a lot of horrific things, but ended up turning it into art. And most of his art is like found objects, right? And so it's super inspiring, because it's like he takes this stuff that people threw away and they find it in the dump or whatever, and then he turns it into this incredible art piece. We all have the power to do that. And so it's realizing that like this, whatever super casual conversation you had with the server at the restaurant the other day is actually a novel waiting to happen. That the color of the walls contrasting with the sun, that nobody else noticed, but if you really noticed it, and the shadow, there's all this cool stuff, like when I was out running the other day, it was just this confluence of timing, but there's like electrical wires that run over the path, right? And there was like a loop hanging from one of them. Well, like I'm running, and, because I'm older and I don't want to trip, I look down a lot to see where my feet are going. And there's this amazing like circle frame like on the path that's just the reflection of the
from
wires, right?
above.
Yeah. But I'm like, it's so awesome, right? But that stuff's there all the time. We're just trained to go through life without noticing it. And it brings a lot more beauty and nuance to our lives. And whether that's through poetry, like I've been writing a lot about this idea that I'm working on with my friend Michael Dickman, who's a poetry professor at Princeton, who used to work here 25 years ago, about a poetic approach to leadership. And more to come on that down the road. But, it just makes you notice like all this little stuff. And then when you notice, then you start to pay more attention to how do I put more beauty into the world.
I can't even find the words to tell you how it's just so interesting. And I think people will immediately identify with this, because it's so easy to go walk outside and look up.
Yeah, there's stuff everywhere. And the John O'Donohue, who I mentioned earlier, the Irish writer, theologian, whatever, he said in the years before he passed away, which is now like 20 years ago, he said that the world is suffering from a crisis of ugliness. And I think that's true. Turn on the news.
Perfect segue.
Yeah, and what I would say is that I, having studied beliefs and worked on myself a lot, like I've long since abandoned the zero-sum game mentality, which is still quite common. If they get a job, I'm losing a job. If they get money, I'm losing money. Here, I and we as an organization have the abundance mentality, which is there's plenty for everybody. And the better you do, like if you get a big client, it's going to help me because you might send them a Zingerman's gift basket or a set of signed books for a gift. And then
they're getting candy bars. I can tell you that.
Awesome. And then they might, well, I can sign books too for gifts. So
well,
anyway, whatever, but they get that. And then we get more business, and it all came because you got a new client, right? So if you look at it from the abundance mindset, that's good. But I would say that with beauty and ugliness, it's a zero-sum game. So the less beauty, the more ugliness, the more beauty, the less ugliness. So one of the ways to combat the current crisis of spirit or whatever in the country is just to keep putting beauty out in the world. And beauty doesn't just mean a painting. It's beauty of grace of how you dealt with a difficult situation. It's the grace that you helped, an employee who's really struggling. It's a beauty of how you served the food in our world, or how you answered the phone. Like those are all artistic acts. And so the more beauty we put into the world, we are combating and resisting the negative forces.
Thank you for sharing that, Ari. Appreciate it greatly.
You got it.
You have time for dignity?
Forces, let's look at dignity.
Yeah, let's look at dignity.
So in a sense, the two fit together because the pamphlet that I wrote, which is called A Revolution of Dignity in the 21st Century Workplace, came out of trying to deal with the despair of an enormous amount of essentially ugliness that was imposed in general sense on the world, indirectly on me, but very directly on people in Ukraine, which is at the end of February 2022 when Russia, which means Vladimir Putin, because he's an autocratic ruler, decided to invade Ukraine. And the world is filled with crises. There's lots of them in the Middle East and North
Don't look at the Wall Street Journal today.
Yeah, it's everywhere. So I'm not here to say in the least that the invasion of Ukraine is worse than Gaza or Somalia or the Uyghurs in northern China or poverty in urban America. These are all terrible things. And the historian Yuval Noah Harari taught me there's no hierarchy of emotion. So I'm not here to argue over which crisis is worse, only to say that crisis really hit me in an emotionally difficult way. Maybe it's because I studied the region. I don't know, but it just felt horrible, and I felt incredibly helpless. And after a few days, as I wrote in the pamphlet, I started to realize that I wasn't just like slightly down, I sort of entering despair. And having done all this work that you nicely alluded to earlier around self-management, I don't get into despair very often because I've spent a lifetime learning.
But if you do, you better roll around in it for a while.
Well, I've taught myself how to get back up before it gets down to that level. But in this case, it got there. Like I just felt super helpless, and I was like, I don't know what to do. Like I could go to Poland with Jose Andres, who I've met and runs an amazing organization with World Central Kitchen. But like, I'm not going to be any better at chopping onions there than anybody else. And I got a big job here, so I didn't do that. And I'm like, I'm not picking up a gun and joining the foreign service. So what do I do? Anyway, long story short, I did what every good introverted history major starts doing when we're really stumped, which is study, because that's what I know how to do best, maybe. And so I realized that I knew a lot about Russian history, like not a PhD level, but for the average American, I knew a fair bit. But I realized, honestly, I knew very little about Ukrainian history. And although Vladimir Putin's story is there is no Ukrainian history, it's just part of Russia, it's completely not true. And there is a fascinating and inspiring and often painful and often uplifting history of Ukraine. And if anything, Russia emerged from Ukraine, not the other way around, despite Putin's propagandistic approach. Anyway, I started to study Ukrainian history, and it's not like I found anything that everybody who had paid more attention than me didn't already know, but I just didn't know it. Yeah. So this is my simplified version. But, when the Soviet Union fell in the early 90s, Ukraine became its own independent country again, and went along still very much in the post-Soviet Russian sphere of influence, which meant that even though it was an independent country, it was still very
in the family.
Yeah, restricted and managed to a great deal from Russia. Anyway, fast forwarding to 2013, so 12 years ago this summer, the president of Ukraine, for whatever reason, began conversations with the European Union that was going to make like a much more open relationship between Ukraine and the EU, which for people in Ukraine, especially younger people with their whole life ahead of them, was super inspiring because
Big deal.
here in
Travel.
the US, yeah, for you and me, I understand that not everybody has the financial means or access, but for people like you and me, like thinking of your junior year abroad in Italy was not that big a deal, or your family took you on vacation to England for 2 weeks, or you were 23 and you went to visit the family friend in Sweden, like whatever. Like these are just sort of normal, if not always within reach for everybody, they're still kind of common things. Anyway, if you were in the Eastern Bloc, they weren't, because getting out of Ukraine to travel to France wasn't as simple as you just got on a plane with no visa and went. So all of a sudden he's in these talks and they're like going to open up the West. And if you're 19 or 20 or 22, is like, man, oh man, my whole life looks better. Hope levels go up. And then in November of 2013, for whatever reason, at the last minute, he pulled the deal and signed a deal instead with Russia, which sent all, especially the younger people, in hindsight, kind of into despair. Understandably, hope levels were high, then it crashes. So in the fall
Nothing
of
like creating expectations.
in the fall of 2013 in November, after that happened, both, especially younger people, began to gather on the central square of Kyiv, which is known as the Maidan, so people might have heard that term, to protest. And they stayed out every night for over 3 months. And sometimes it was thousands, sometimes it was hundreds of thousands. Kyiv is the same roughly latitude as Ann Arbor, so it's not exactly warm in December at night. So this wasn't like, laying out on the beach having fun.
Yeah. It was a commitment.
Yet they stayed out there determinedly. As things went along, at one point, the president of Ukraine had what my business partner Paul would say was an idea that sounded good, but was not a sound idea. And that was to, he thought, send in the police to basically beat up the young people on the square, in the belief that their parents, fearing for their kids' lives, would force the kids to stop demonstrating and make them go home. But it backfired, and I can barely say it without crying, but the parents went and joined him. And so instead of getting rid of the protests, it got worse for him.
It doubled it.
And all of a sudden you had every age group and every walk of life and every religion and every, sexual orientation, everybody, who cared about the country and freedom was out there demonstrating. So at the end of February 2014, and that at the time was called the Revolution of Dignity. And when I read that, I was like, okay, all of a sudden I know what to do. Like, I can't make Putin stop. I can't go there and fix it. But what I can do is dignity, because it's within my own power. I don't need permission from anybody else. And I realized that in a country where dignity is the norm, people like Putin would never be in power.
Of course.
And conversely, in a country run like Russia, in an autocratic setting where authority is used arbitrarily in very terrible ways, we could never do business the way we do. And this is something people here, I think, don't understand at all, which is like, when you have a national culture where people are afraid to speak, you can't have good employee engagement. If you have a culture where people are afraid to say the wrong thing, open book management doesn't work.
Yeah, the suggestion box is not full.
Correct. Only with fake ones going,
yes,
Chris
we
does
love
the
you.
best
Everything's great.
podcaster in the country. We love Chris. Chris is, so I realized, like, if Putin's in power, we can't work the way we work. But if we create dignity every day all over our ecosystem, it diminishes the odds of people like Putin coming to power. So I just was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then I was the same thing that you kind of asked about before. What's the system? What's the definition? And I learned from Maggie at Zinc Train, like, it doesn't work if you don't have clear expectations. So saying dignity, rah, rah, rah.
Well, that's my learn. My learn is I'm
great.
pretty good. I'm pretty good at figuring it out. I got to get it in the system.
Yeah. So like, what does dignity really mean on a daily basis, so that when I talk to you or your client or your kid or your group, I can explain it. So I spent a long time studying dignity, and then I ended up with 6 elements, which I can rock through pretty quickly.
Yes, please.
that if you just do these 6, I believe you create dignity. And I can't scientifically prove they're the right ones, but I will say, having been teaching it for 2 years plus now, it seems to work, and I still stand by them. So,
And you wouldn't keep doing it if it didn't work.
no, totally. So the first one is to honor the humanity of everybody. I mean, the pamphlet's focused on the workplace, but it's really about anybody that we deal with. It's just to honor the obvious reality that everybody matters, that everybody's struggling, that everybody has hopes, everybody has dreams, everybody has fears. Pretty much everybody, even people with money, have financial anxiety. We all have relationship struggles, whatever. And that it doesn't mean we have to be the therapist of everybody that we work with, but it does mean that you can spend 60 seconds, man, asking them how their kid's doing in school. Like, it doesn't take that long. You can take them 90 seconds and ask how their mother that went into elder care is doing. Easy. So that's number one. Number 2 is to be authentic. And then I added in there in parentheses, but not by acting out. So there's a very common, I would suggest, unhealthy misconception in the country right now that going like, Chris, you're a jerk and I can't stand your podcast, is authentic. But I'm going to suggest it's unhelpful and unhealthy. And there's ways to express one's vulnerability that are not dishonest, but that don't demean the other person.
Ari, one of our values is front door in our business. And everybody always says, well, it doesn't mean you could be a jerk and scream front door.
Right. Correct. Maggie from Zinc Train taught me years ago, she called it the principal police. So it's the people who run around yelling at you because you violated the principles, not realizing the obvious, which is they're violating the principles by the way they're telling you about how you violated the principles. Anyway, so the second one is to be authentic. And that this works in all directions. So we need to do it for ourselves, and then we need to create a workspace or an ecosystem. If it's a family or a church group or whatever, that we can let people do them also. So it's not just me being authentic with you. I need to create a space where you feel like you can be real with me. Right. So the first is to honor the humanity. The second is authenticity. The third is to create an organization where everyone has a meaningful say. It doesn't mean you vote on everything. Voting, I highly recommend people vote here in the US, but voting alone does not make a meaningful say. They vote in Russia too. It doesn't mean anything. So voting is not the answer. The answer is, how do you create systems and structures and a culture where people have a meaningful say? They may not get things the way they want. I often don't get things the way I want. But the point is, somebody listened and there was like a thoughtful conversation around it, not a dismissive, shut up, you're just a blah, we don't care what you think. And so here that could happen imperfectly, always through open book management, through open meetings, through the bottom line change process that you showed the pamphlet of, that anyone here can start, even if they're not the decision maker, through being willing to have one-on-one conversations pretty much with anybody whenever they want. Things like that give a meaningful say. The fourth one is to start with positive beliefs. This is a much longer conversation that we can do a second podcast on beliefs.
That'd be great. You've got a book on it.
But it's a giant book, unlike the chapbook, which is like an espresso shot. This is like a 2-year supply of coffee. But it's based on my understanding and realization that if you begin with negative beliefs about anybody, it's not going to go well. You'll feel better while you complain about them. But even if you don't agree, you could still have positive beliefs, which is, I don't like what they're doing. I don't like what they said. But making up conspiracy stories about how evil they are is not really helping me, and it's not helping them. So it's just starting with the belief they're doing the best they can. And when I go, it's not saying I'm not going to bring up the issues and ask for change, but I'm going to do it with the belief they're a good person, not a negative one. The fifth piece is to help everybody in our organization get to greatness. Now, the point is they get to define what greatness is, and that for that to work, their version of greatness needs to fit the frame of our organization. So it needs to be within our vision and mission and values and beliefs. So if somebody comes, I often have said of late, if somebody comes and goes, I love Zingerman's, I want to start the Zingerman's Nazi Party chapter, that's not going to fit within our frame of
No.
values. So, but I can treat them with dignity while I explain that and not demean them and go, how could you say that after you've been here 5 years? Don't you understand what we're doing? Like you can imagine the rant. But the rant would be what you described earlier. It's not aligned with our values. So them getting to greatness. Some people work here and they're here for 4 months for a summer job. They just want to have fun, get paid, meet some nice people, and learn a couple things. Some people want to be managing partners, everything in between. And then the sixth one, which I think is the hardest in my mind, is to create some modicum of equity. It's not easy to do. There's no perfect equity point any more than you could perfectly balance that teeter-totter thing when you were a kid trying to stand in the middle of it. But we can work at it. And when I teach the new staff orientation, which I just did again last Sunday, I tell them the truth. Like, okay, y'all, it's not going to shock you. My pay is higher than yours.
Yep.
Mind-boggling. The problem isn't that. The problem is if my pay was as much higher than yours as what you see in the news about some of the leaders of corporate organizations, that's crazy. And it's not just equity of money, it's equity of emotional support, equity of social resources, equity of financial aid, equity of educational resources, et cetera.
It also means being able to talk to anybody in the business.
Yeah.
And titles and equality and
So if we do those 6 things, honor the humanity, be real and authentic, make sure everybody has a meaningful say, start with positive beliefs, help everybody in our lives get to greatness, and then work imperfectly towards equity, I believe that creates dignity. Now, the beauty of this is you could start now. You don't need a certification. You don't need a government grant. You don't need your business partner to do it. You don't need your spouse to do it. You could just do it. You can do it with
a PowerPoint and convince your team to do it.
You don't need permission. And so you could just do this with your kid. You could do it when you're mad at the umpire at your kid's baseball game. You could do it with the 3rd grade teacher of your kid. You could do it on the way home when you're at the, like I was last night, waiting for my prescription at the pharmacy, and I really wanted to get home and it was taking a while. But I don't need to act out on the poor pharmacist who's choosing positive beliefs. It's not their fault that they're short-staffed.
No.
It's not their fault that whatever Rite Aid closed and there's less pharmacies in Ann Arbor. It's not their fault that the manager, blah, blah, blah. So just treating them with dignity, even though I am frustrated and I do want to go home and get some sleep, but I can manage myself well enough to deal with them with dignity. So that just spreads, man.
Ari, you've been incredibly generous with ideas and time. And speaking of dignity, operating with a bad foot, if you don't mind me saying.
Yeah.
So very much appreciate you and the way you approach life and business. I have one question I'd just love to ask to kind of bring us home and then take it anywhere you'd like. And I always ask everybody, what advice would they give their 21-year-old self? But I'm just going to change it as, what advice would you give that dishwasher?
Well, I do get asked this fairly often.
Oh, do you really?
And the answers are in the books, because that's all the stuff that I wish I would have known at 21. And to your earlier question about writing, there's many benefits. It benefits me, but it also benefits the people who are interested in it. And whatever I've learned, I try to communicate it in a way that other people can put it to work without having to screw up all the stuff I screwed up to learn it, or having to read all the books that I had to read in order to learn it. And I hope they do go read more books. But, like what I wrote yesterday about marketing and the realization that marketing can be a regenerative activity, not an extractive one, and honoring Walter Brueggemann, who just died last week at 92. Maybe a few more people learned about Walter Brueggemann, and maybe a couple people here and there started to think differently about marketing. And then maybe they make their marketing more regenerative, and maybe 3 of their clients' lives are improved in the process.
We'll be sure to put that link in the show notes, and they're always popular in that regard. Ari, the world thinks you're nuts because you give out your email address all the time.
It's Ari,
but I know the world
email away, and you'll put all the e-news books and all that. And Zing Train, of course, as you know, is our training business. And you and I met when I was speaking, and I do speak a fair bit, so that's also an option through Zing Train. And I'll be doing an event in Boston. If anybody's listening from that area in August, if you email me, I'll send you back the dates for that. That's open to the public.
And we'll make sure to list the community of businesses links as well, the deli, the mail order and some of the other things.
Yeah,
Ari,
and we have a little food tour business too. So if people want to go eat the kind of food that we eat and learn, we go to like Spain and France and Ireland and all kinds of good stuff. So
I'm always learning.
if you
Ari,
need a last minute present, it's at a big scale, man. They'll remember that one forever.
Ari, thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.